4. Further theoretical application and case analysis on protests. Undoubtedly, China's economy has experienced rapid growth in the last 40 years. However, this progress has also led to the accumulation of various social issues and an increase in the intensity of civil protest and resistance movements. The fundamental reason behind these social phenomena is inherently intertwined with China's political system. After a period of 3 years of lockdown, civil unrest in China has experienced substantial transformations. Transitioning from being predominantly focused on economic demands and being depoliticized to bravely present political appeals that resonate strongly. The constrained reflection belief model is subsequently applied in an effort to account for the resistant behaviors of civil disobedience in extremely oppressive environments and the contradictory behaviors of protesters and other civil disobedience activities. Finally, political strategy applications of such cognitive models are also mentioned. For point 1, close relationship between China's economic development and social protests. China's economic success over the last 4 decades can be attributed to the integration and application of the demographic, resource, institutional, and globalization dividends. Stated differently, the CCP's centralized system worked in concert with foreign capital to make the most use of China's natural resources and cheap labor, thereby advancing China's manufacturing sector into the global value division. Many economists and commentators take China as a global superpower, an usher of a new global power distribution, the world's second-largest economy, world's leading exporter, and second-largest importer in 2018, and so on. In terms of economic development, it is indisputable that Communist China emerged victorious in the most recent wave of economic globalization. However, the numerous civil protests, both large and small, that have arisen as a result of the numerous structural problems that have emerged during China's economic development cannot be concealed. Despite the country's economic achievements, China's economy was still seemingly booming in 2009. However, He Qinglian, a specialist in modern economic and social issues, noted that the country's social uprisings over the previous 10 years were closely linked to the economic growth model. She believed that public policy is set by how the Chinese government gets resources, which in turn sets the pattern of economic growth and, by extension, the type of social resistance. Professor Su Qingyang, an economist, has hit the nail on the head when he says that the fact that the government owns land is at the heart of many of the biggest social problems we face today, such as inequality, corruption, and social instability. Excessive concentration of political power cannot lead to efficient and equitable distribution of economic resources. The China Family Finance Survey and Research Center of Southwestern University of Finance and Economics released survey data in 2012 that showed the Gini coefficient of Chinese family income was 0.61 by 2010. This was much higher than the global average Gini coefficient of 0.44 published by the World Bank at the same time, showing a huge difference in Chinese family income. Since the Gini coefficient was declared to be 0.412 in 2000, Chinese officials have not made this data public. More than 27.7 million people were unemployed in urban areas in 2011, according to a different report from the center. The unemployment rates in eastern, central, and western China were 6.9%, 8.3%, and 14.1%, respectively. China is a country accustomed to protest. Landesa reports that there were 180,000 mass incidents in China in 2010, 65% of which were land-related. In 2015 alone, a Chinese netizen named Lu Yuyu, with the alias Wikidana, manually collects 29,000 protest information from tweets. 16% of the posts talked about protesters being beaten by armed police, public safety officers, or city law enforcement officers. Between July 2013 and June 2016, there were labor protests almost everywhere in China. They were also the main issue in Chinese cities, followed by issues with real estate and land. Besides, the data indicates that very few protests are related to the protection of civil or political rights, and the database contains not a single anti-regime protest. Several studies conducted by mainland Chinese scholars support this point as well. Xiao Tongbiao argued in 2012 that mass incidents in China lacked the characteristics of anti-regime and anti-system protests and were therefore instrumentalist in nature. Zhou Yuqian claimed in 2016 that social protests in China are distinctly depoliticized. For point 2, completely different kind of social protests during the lockdown. During period of the lockdown, however, some symbolic protests have become very different from what they were before. The most striking characteristic is that they all made clear political demands. Second, all over the country, slogans of response and supporting each other have come up within a short period of time. Third, support for the white paper movement has also begun around the world. Furthermore, global support for the white paper movement has emerged. A very crucial point to add is that the series of events occurred before and after the 20th National Congress of the CCP. The Sidong Bridge incident occurred 9 days before the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, and the Urumqi fire occurred 33 days afterward. Protests began in Urumqi the day after the fire. White Paper Movement and Urumqi Middle Road protest in Shanghai began on day 2. Beijing held the Liangma Bridge protest on day 3. After Xi Jinping met with EU leaders and complained that the 3-year lockdown had frustrated the people, especially the young, the lockdown and dynamic clearing were gradually lifted on December 2, 2022. This meeting has extraordinary significance, because at this meeting, Xi Jinping will be re-elected as president of the country, general secretary of the CPC Central Committee, and chairman of the Military Commission for the 3rd time. In Sidong Overpass Bridge protest, Peng Zizhou is the only protagonist, and he clearly proclaimed through the loudspeaker that remove the dictatorial traitor Xi Jinping and want food, want freedom, and want votes. And by making thick smoke, he tried to attract nearby people to watch. He unfurled a large banner on the bridge that reads, "We want meals, not nucleic acid tests. We want freedom, not lockdowns. We want dignity, not lies. We want reform, not a cultural revolution. We want votes, not leaders. We want to be a citizen, not a slave. Boycott classes, go on strike. Remove the dictatorial traitor Xi Jinping. Rise up, people unwilling to be slaves to a dictator. Anti-dictatorship, anti-despotism, save China. One vote for each person for the presidency." This protester had previously posted the same slogans on Twitter. Additionally, he left detailed promotional materials spanning 23 pages on ResearchGate, urging the public to initiate class boycotts, strikes, and car honking activities starting on October 16, the day of the 20th Party Congress. In Shanghai's Urumqi Middle Road protest, most of protesters were young people, shouted a variety of slogans, including the most direct political demands. Do not want health codes, freedom or death, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, Communist Party step down, Xi Jinping step down. And shouting serve the people at the police, citizens also loudly questioned the police on the spot, saying, "Are your families and children not citizens? Why do you point your guns at us? Are the police meant to be used against the people?" In Beijing's Liangma River protest, most of the more than 100 protesters were young and middle-aged. They chanted slogans such as, "We want universal values. We want freedom, equality, democracy, and the rule of law. We reject dictatorship. And we don't want personality cults." When asked by the BBC why they did this protest, they replied in English, "It's my duty," which is the same as some students said during the Tiananmen incident. For point 3, the theoretical application of constrained reflection belief model, an extreme situation of oppression and resistance, lockdown period. I attempt to analyze the relationship between oppression and resistance from the perspective of psychopolitics, incorporating insights from the preceding model. The protest movements across China over the past 3 years, particularly following the Urumqi fire incident, fundamentally represent resistance against the oppression of the totalitarian rule under Xi's leadership within the Chinese Communist Party. This oppression stems from a significant power gap between the ruling class and the ruled class in Chinese society, coupled with the arbitrary actions of totalitarian rulers. Where there is the power gap, there is a potential abuse of power. The ruling class must be subject to a minimum of 2 constraints in order to prevent power abuses from occurring. To begin with, individuals in positions of authority must adhere to a sufficiently elevated ethical compass in order to abstain from carrying out possible wrongdoings. Further, stringent legislation must be implemented to deter those in positions of authority from abusing it, including prohibitive measures beforehand and severe punishment afterward. Both of these conditions, however, are non-existent in Communist China. Consequently, the distinctive totalitarian oppression that is emblematic of China, including the imposition of lockdowns and the denial of vital resources to individuals, becomes exceedingly enforceable. By restricting the circulation of citizens and essential goods and imposing lockdown measures in almost every city in China, the Chinese government was able to further solidify its authority. The process of political oppression is always accompanied by psychological oppression, which mainly includes learned helplessness, surplus powerlessness, obedience to authority, and internalization of images. These four psychological processes were mirrored in the 3 years the Chinese were locked down. Firstly, learned helplessness. In the past 3 years, Chinese people in different regions have been repeatedly blocked, gradually losing confidence in the future, and the sense of despair is gradually increasing. Medical experts say the 3 years of lockdown have left Chinese people with depression and anxiety, which can take 10 to 20 years to recover. Chinese adolescents have experienced a decline in their mental well-being over the past 3 years, characterized by feelings of hopelessness, psychological collapse, and contemplation of suicide. Second, surplus powerlessness. The inherent sense of powerlessness resulting from the constraints imposed by the social milieu. People don't even choose to fight back when they have the opportunity to do so. Throughout the country, the gates of many communities were sealed off and streets were cordoned off with iron sheets, but not many people resisted. A fire victim in Urumqi, Xinjiang province, 27 years old Abdul Hafiz said, "Even the doors of houses were locked from outside. At least if my family could go out of the door or to the roof of the building to rescue themselves, they would have survived." In the quarantine bus crashes in Guizhou province, some said that such a tragedy could have happened to anyone, given the government's fixation on eliminating cases and ordinary people's powerlessness to resist it. 3. Obedience to authority. Chinese people who disobey or oppose anti-human risk control measures face consequences rather than rewards for their compliance. An example of a typical case is when Zhang Dongwei, a Central Academy of Fine Arts graduate, was charged in August 2022 with writing 8 Chinese characters, "I have become numb after 3 years," on each of the 8 Beijing-based nucleic acid testing booths. He was subsequently convicted by the Procuratorate of arbitrarily damaging other people's property in the crime of provocation and disturbance offense. As of December 2022, Zhang Dongwei has been detained in the Chaoyang District Detention Center for at least 3 months, and he has already shouldered the corresponding financial and mental punishment. 4. Internalization of images. People in China who try to fight back legally are often found guilty of provocation and disturbance offense or are detained in secret. When they are freed, it could change their lives and the lives of their families. Their families could also become sacrifice of the so-called political guilt by association. Civil journalists Fan Bin, Chen Qiushi, Li Zihua, and Zhang Zhan, who were arrested and detained by the Chinese Communist authorities during the Wuhan lockdown, all had similar experiences. Totalitarian rulers, arguably the most brutal group of oppressors, do not feel bound to behave toward dominated groups in ethical ways because they exclude these collectives from the realm of moral discourse altogether. But the experiences of 40 years of reform and opening up have helped most Chinese people, especially young people, to achieve the process of conscientization, which is also the transformation process of political beliefs discussed in this essay. The rapid economic development of the past years has left Chinese people with little time to consider what the real lift they have. Therefore, regardless of whether the information is useful in making the right decision or the wrong decision, there is not enough information in the reflection session for them to change their beliefs. Insufficient time allocated for reflection hinders the application of critical thinking, resulting in the derivation of few genuinely advantageous conclusions, information that could have potentially influenced a paradigm shift in one's belief. But the 3 years lockdown really forced Chinese people to have to accept a huge amount of time to introspection and reflection. This is due in part to the fact that smartphones and the internet continue to expose the various evil deeds of the totalitarian government during the lockdown. Everything happened, and this poses a psychological challenge to average individuals. Also, through VPN software, almost all young people who have circumvented the Great Firewall can also identify the huge differences in COVID policies between China and Western countries. For example, the Chinese government never provided subsidies to the people during the blockade period, but the blockade measures were particularly strict. In this way, the process of psychopolitical education is gradually being completed. Initial protests are conducted via smartphones and the internet, frequently involving the principal form of resistance, the exchange of information, sarcasm, and irony. In the process, people have been able to reach a consensus on the source of their diminished quality of life. Up to the Urumqi incident, people's psychology and cognitive capacities were entirely destroyed by the terrible conclusion of the accident, in the conversation between the victims prior to their deaths, triggering the formation of new political beliefs. Subsequently, individuals protested in the streets while chanting Xi Jinping stepped down and the Communist Party stepped down. By this juncture, the protesters had pronounced the communist totalitarian regime of China, which was founded upon an absolutist monarchy, bankrupt. But the progression of a nation's history is anything but straightforward and linear. The constrained reflection belief model is also inherently abstract, simplistic, and marginally idealized. The liberation process of China's oppressed will be arduous and tortuous due to the immense class gap in Chinese society and the accompanying cognitive differences. In addition to the inertia of people's thinking and the arduous nature of the process of improving cognition,